What's the number one most underappreciated yoga pose? Well, in my personal experience, in over 25 years in the yoga world, I feel that the most underappreciated yoga pose is Purvottanasana, aka reverse plank. And here's what it looks like. Hands back behind us, legs out in front, and we lift our hips up off the floor. So this is Purvottanasana, and I feel that it is quite underappreciated in the yoga world because first of all, it has a ton of positive benefits to offer our bodies, especially yoga practitioners' bodies. And second of all, it's underappreciated because it's not the most common yoga pose out there in like yoga classes everywhere. Like for example, how often do you see Purvottanasana in like a vinyasa flow class compared to chaturanga, which is kind of like flipped over from Purvottanasana? Like, don't we tend to have 50 or more chaturangas in some like power vinyasa yoga classes? And then how often do we see Purvottanasana? So on the whole, I don't see that Purvottanasana is taught that commonly. But even when Purvottanasana is taught, even when we do include Purvottanasana in yoga sequences, I don't feel that the pose is typically treated in a way that really garners us the benefits that could be there for us. So I'm going to explain. Let me explain both of those aspects. So first of all, why do I think Purvottanasana is so good for us yoga practitioners? So that is because it is one of the only and maybe the best ways to truly strengthen our hamstring muscles within the traditional yoga lexicon. So within the traditional yoga asanas that we have on our hands, I think Purvottanasana is maybe the best and maybe the only way to like super effectively strengthen the hamstrings. Now that's because our hamstring muscles are a group of three muscles. They live on the back of our thigh, they cross the hip joint, and they cross the knee joint. So in general, if we want to target the hamstrings for strength, we have to work hip extension. So hip extension is like this direction of movement. We have to work hip extension against resistance. And then we also have to have relatively straight knees. So that's why something like bridge pose, for example, like good old bridge pose, this is hip extension, but the knees are so bent that we're really not recruiting very much hamstrings here. This is like mainly glutes as far as the posterior chain goes for bridge pose. But Purvottanasana has that excellent combination of we are working hip extension, but it's paired with straight knees because it looks like this. So this is such a good way to really light up the backs of our legs. And I think that hamstring strengthening is super beneficial for all human bodies, but I especially think that it's important for yoga practitioners because in a typical yoga setting, we really just don't strengthen the hamstrings very effectively at all. There are just not that many opportunities to do that, and not in a way that really involves like a lot of load and that could truly be strengthening. Yes, we do a lot of stretching of the hamstrings in yoga, and there are some, like for example, diving forward into a forward fold. This does work the hamstrings. They do work eccentrically, like as we lower down, and when we lift back up from a forward fold, they do work concentrically, but it's pretty minimal. Like they're only working against the resistance of the length of our torso. And as any practiced yoga practitioner who's practiced for more than a little bit, we have certainly adapted to the loads that are there for us here. And so we've really adapted to any potential strengthening that could be there for us in something like a simple standing forward fold. Not that there was really very much strengthening there to begin with. So it's not that we don't like activate, and load a little bit the hamstrings in our yoga practice. We do in some places, but nowhere do we actually do it with a lot of load and really ask them to work with against a lot of resistance. And that's ideally what you want for true strength adaptations. And we get that in Purvottanasana. So that's why I think the pose is important for yogis. We want to have strong hamstrings. Strong hamstrings can potentially be protective against something called yoga butt, which you may have heard of, which is proximal hamstring tendinopathy or pain up at the top hamstring attachment. So we're not going to get into yoga butt too much, but just suffice it to say that the stronger that our hamstrings are, the potentially more resilient we are to developing something like yoga butt. So that's why I think Purvottanasana is so great. But then, like I said, I don't see it. First of all, I don't see it in very many yoga classes, period, especially not compared to so many other yoga poses like chaturanga and plank and vinyasas and all this. Purvottanasana is just not really like a star player out there. But then even when it is included, like I mentioned earlier, I don't find that it's treated in a way that is really a truly strengthening way. And here's what I mean by that. In my earlier days in the yoga world, I was a dedicated Ashtanga practitioner. And in Ashtanga, we have the primary series. And in the primary series, we do have Purvottanasana. We also have 50 plus chaturangas because of all those vinyasas we do. But we have one instance of Purvottanasana in Ashtanga primary series. We do it, but we only do it one time. And just one time is just not really enough to be, very strengthening. And then even in the one time that we are supposed to do Purvottanasana in primary series, we are supposed to hold it for 5 breaths. However, Purvottanasana is a super hard, challenging pose, especially if we have not really challenged and strengthened our hamstrings before. So most people, including myself back in the early days, most people that I see do Purvottanasana, for them it looks like this. They go, okay, move on, let's do chaturanga. And they just hardly spend any time there at all. And in order to really create strength adaptations, we need to accumulate time and volume, and we need to practice something with frequency, and we need to get close to momentary muscular failure. There are all these parameters. So I think Purvottanasana has the potential to be strengthening if we treated it in a strengthening way, but I find that we generally don't in yoga. Another thing is that not only do we tend to rush on through Purvottanasana and just not really linger there, and that's going to bypass the strength. Not only that, but because it's such a tough pose, I also find that when it is offered, we usually are also, or we're often also offered the alternative of doing reverse table instead of Purvottanasana. So it's often taught like this, lift up into Purvottanasana with straight legs, or if you don't want to do that, or if that's too hard, then do reverse table. So then you would bend your knees and you would lift up. And this would be like your alternate or your modification, your regression for Purvottanasana. And I think that's totally fine. It gets the job done. It moves us through the yoga class. But I don't really think reverse table is a great regression for Purvottanasana if hamstring strength is our goal. Because like I mentioned earlier, in order to strengthen the hamstrings, we need straight knees or straightish knees, and we need to work hip extension. But reverse table is very bent knees. This is a lot like bridge pose, which I showed earlier, bent knees and then we lift up, which means that reverse table is not really a hamstrings targeter, and it's more of just a glutes targeter. So it's an excellent pose. I teach reverse table a lot, but I wouldn't teach it if my goal was to work on hamstring strength. I would teach something that actually worked the hamstrings. So with all of that said, I think that here are a few ways that we can work with Purvottanasana and treat it in a more strengthening way. So first off, I think for most people, just straight up Purvottanasana done with straight legs, hands down. This, I think, is too hard for most yoga practitioners. There are some super strong people out there, and then it's fine. But I think it's too hard for most people, and they're never going to build strength because they're never going to be able to really spend time there. So the way that we can approach it that would maybe be smarter if we really want to build strength is we can start to regress Purvottanasana, but instead of regressing it by doing a different pose like reverse table, we can still do Purvottanasana, but a version that's just regressed. It reduces the load involved and the amount of work we have to do. So one way we can do that is to simply elevate our hands. So hands down is going to be the strongest, most challenging variation. But if we place our hands up on some yoga blocks, all we need are 2 yoga blocks, and most yoga studios have that. Then when we lift up, we have more of a mechanical advantage. We're not at such a disadvantage for our hamstrings to lift us up because our upper body is up a little bit higher. And that will make the pose a little more accessible. It's still tough, but it does regress it a bit. And if hands on blocks is still too tough, and I'm sure that it might be for many people, but if you still wanted to work with Purvottanasana, you could just consider elevating your hands even higher, like up onto a chair seat. I know that chairs are not like super common in every yoga studio, and there aren't usually enough for all students if it's like a full class, so I know that. But this is also just still like for our own educational purposes. And also because maybe you will decide to do this in your own practice at home, where maybe you have a chair and you can do this. But hands up on the chair seat will be even more regressed than hands on the yoga blocks. And that would look something like this: hands on the chair seat, and then we walk forward, and then we would start like here in some hip flexion, and then lift up. See how this is Purvottanasana, but with elevated hands, and then we can lower down. And this is another aspect of the pose that I think would be nice if we want to be strengthening about it, is to do repeated Purvottanasanas. Like here I am doing several of them in a row. And when we do several of them in a row, that can be a nice way just to build up the fatigue so that our muscles get to momentary muscular failure, and we're more likely to stimulate strength adaptations. So with all of that said, that's how I think we could treat Purvottanasana in a truly strengthening manner. And just a final point I would throw out there is I have focused on how Purvottanasana is a great hamstring strengthener, but it also does work other muscles. It's not all about the hamstrings, but to me, I think it's super beneficial because of that hamstring strength that it can offer. But we also will target the glutes, and we'll also target the muscles of spinal extension that extend our spine, as well as posterior shoulders. So it's a really good entire posterior chain movement, but it's especially great because of those hamstrings. Now, if you appreciated this content, consider subscribing to my channel so you can stay up to date on all of the content that I share.